Hi, I'm Bri Lynch, head of market insight at EquityZen, and I'm joined here by Jax from our research team. And we're really here to talk about the best way to research a private company. Public markets and private markets are different. There's different tools available to investors depending on what market you're investing in. So we're here to really talk about it all, to demystify what the private markets are like, and highlight key tools, especially those available to EquityZen investors, to help them really make informed investment decisions. So Jax, thanks for joining me.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Bri.
So let's dive right into it. Companies are staying private longer. That growth equity return we've seen has really moved to the private market. So we're seeing a lot more investor interest in investing in these late stage private companies to be able to participate in that growth from earlier in these companies' life cycles. Jax, the information available to investors in the private markets is not the same as in the public markets, and that makes it a little more difficult. Can you talk a little bit about those difficulties?
In terms of looking at private companies, there's just not as much readily sourceable information. So when you look at public companies, there's, requirements for them to file for their financial information by the SEC. That doesn't exist for private companies. So it's really up to those private companies how much information they want to share and put out there. From an investor perspective, it makes it much more difficult to find some of this key information that you may want as an investor. And really requires a lot more due diligence and in-depth sourcing to get some of this information.
Yeah, and that's a really good point. And we'll dive into some of the tools available to EquityZen investors that you and the rest of our research team are putting together to help them in the market. When we're talking about research, there's kind of two levels. There's the macro level, the industry level, and then there's individual company research as well. And both components are important, whether you're public or private market investing, to make smart decisions. One of the tools that we provide to our investors is this private market map. So really, it's a visual way to understand the landscape of a given industry, say AI, fintech, whatever it is, and really have a visual snapshot of who the leaders are in that market. So maybe you're interested in AI and OpenAI, but you don't know who the up and coming names are. So that's one of the tools that can really help investors kind of identify those leaders and, some of the trends that may be emerging in one of these markets. Are there other things that investors should be looking at or thinking about from an industry perspective?
Yeah, I think a big one is obviously industry growth. A company can be doing well, but if the industry isn't A, large enough, or B, not going to grow to be large enough to actually provide investors, upsized returns, then that's obviously a red flag. A counter to that is larger industries that are growing rapidly. Sometimes you can get an investment into a third, fourth, or fifth tier player in one of those industries that may not have the fastest growing financials or customer base or is the largest name in the industry. But because it's going off of that industry growth and has that momentum along with the industry, you can still have some solid returns from that.
We've seen that certainly in crypto, where the broader market momentum, the regulatory tailwinds, increase in investor sentiment has allowed many more platforms and players to grow and do well, especially in the IPO market, than, maybe just the leaders in the market. So, we talked about the industry level. Let's dive in a little bit more on individual private companies. EquityZen offers investments in hundreds of these late stage pre-IPO companies. And a lot of investors come to us and ask, how can they get educated and learn how to make those informed decisions? Jax, you and our team really work to put together all the information for our investors and really give them the resources they need to make that decision. So can you walk through tools available on our platform and how investors should go about using them?
Yeah, certainly. There's a lot of these key tools that can be found on our company page as well as our offering documents. So again, highly recommend, if you're looking to make an investment in a private company, reviewing these different materials that we compile, information, and just making sure you understand what the company is and what it does. Really, the first piece of information that you'll find on the company page is just that. What does the company do? What is their elevator pitch? Kind of the narrative around the company and the problem they're solving. And that kind of builds into the business model, right? So now you understand what they're doing, what the problem they're solving. How are they generating revenue from that problem or solve that they have? Is it, straight to businesses, or is it to consumers that they're selling to? What is their value proposition there? Again, this is all on EquityZen's website, and we go pretty in depth in terms of product lines, pricing, if that's available, if you're looking at a SaaS company, and really any information that's kind of relevant to the business model. We also will look more into like key performance metrics. So financials and growth information can sometimes be rare for private companies. However, we try to do a pretty deep dive into these companies to find any information or insight that we can find that's publicly available into these numbers. That could be either anything from like a press release from the company on financials to a CEO interview that they did where they mentioned growth or revenue information to even, something on LinkedIn that was posted about growth for the companies. We really try to compile as much information that would be helpful in that investment decision. Sometimes it's easy, and there are companies that will regularly publish financials. So Klarna is a great example of that. Before they went public, they were still doing quarterly and yearly financial reports, and it was relatively easy to see their growth trajectory. A lot of other companies may not have anything in terms of revenue and growth. But like I said, we try to find anything that's out there and really provide that for the investors.
We're scouring all the news sources for you. Obviously, do your own due diligence, but we really try to cover that. One of the things that some investors look at, and I would love to get your take on this, is, who the founders are. Have they done this before? Do they have a track record? How much do you think that matters?
I think it's super important. I think the venture capital landscape in general, it's a lot of relationships. Fundraising depends on those relationships. So the founding team is really important. I think they've had a previous startup or a previous private company that they've done well in and either had a successful exit, be an IPO, or if the company was acquired to, a third party firm. That's a really positive sign that the founders know what they're doing. They know how to lead a company. And more importantly, they know how to have a successful exit. Like anything, experience is super important for founders.
You touched on investors. So let's kind of turn to talk a little bit more about funding rounds. So these private companies raise primary funding rounds, meaning that they go out and raise capital from institutional investors. That capital directly funds these companies. So when you hear about the Series A, Series B, Series C in the market, these are those primary funding rounds we're talking about. As each of these rounds are raised, that's reflected on the company's capitalization table. And that cap table is one of the key resources available to investors understand valuations and how they're investing. Can you dive a little bit more into cap tables and what investors should really look to know?
Yeah, certainly. So to your point, capitalization tables are a key point that I would recommend investors to look at and understand when they're investing in a company. Essentially, it's a breakdown of the equity structure in a firm. So you will have common stock and you'll have various classes of preferred stock typically. That common stock can be anything from employee option pools to founders ownership to holdings for RSUs or preferred stock when they look to convert after a liquidity event. And then the preferred rounds, to your point, is more so those investments that are coming in via those funding rounds. Typically venture capital firms that are making investments into these companies to try to get a return out of them. A couple key things I guess I'll highlight on capitalization tables to pay attention to when reviewing them. I think the first one, to your point, is who's invested in these companies. There are larger players in the venture capital industry that once you see them invest in a company, that can signal different signs, whether they're typically a late stage investor and only hold investments for a few years because they expect a future liquidity event, or early stage investors that just historically have had really good performance and great jobs at picking specific names in specific industries. So all these things are super important when looking at investors in these firms. Additionally, the actual terms of these funding rounds. So we will get filings that are publicly filed, typically with the state of Delaware, but it can be various other states or countries that will have the breakdown of the terms for these funding rounds. So I think the biggest thing is liquidation preference. Liquidation preference is essentially if there is a liquidity event outside of an IPO, these investors have the ability to be paid out first prior to common stock. Now, typically it would only be their investment before it's pro rata across, the whole equity lineup. But occasionally there can be a liquidation multiple that will have this be greater than their initial investment. So obviously that's not a great sign if you're investing in common stock. So something again to kind of keep an eye out for and to check and do your due diligence before investing. Another thing is liquidity rank. This is basically the order at which investors are paid out during a liquidity event, typically an acquisition. IPOs are a little bit more straightforward. Typically, preferred shares will convert to common and everyone will share pro rata. But more so, these acquisitions are where you kind of need to understand the terms a little bit better for these funding rounds. And historically, for private companies, their liquidity events typically are acquisitions, much more so than IPOs.
As you just highlighted there, there's such a depth of information available when you dive into the filings of these companies. And it's not information that's readily available, going back to what we talked about early on. So that's something where our research team is going through the filings, recreating the cap tables, and presenting that information on EquityZen's platform in a much more digestible way so that you have that information to help you make a smart investment decision. One of the other key parts on the cap table that can help kind of contextualize the investment opportunity for investors is the valuation of a company at that funding round that the company last raised. So let's say a company just raised their Series D at an $8 billion valuation. You'll see that reflected in the cap table we put together. So when you're evaluating an investment opportunity, you could say, am I investing at a discount to that $8 billion round? So at a price less than that $8 billion round, am I investing at a price above that $8 billion round? And for different industries and different companies, that pricing may change. But certainly as we look about determining what prices make sense in the private markets where trade information isn't as readily available, that funding round that's reflected in the cap table is also one of the key inputs.
Yeah, and that's a great point. When we're looking at various companies and offering deals on our platform for different investors, that's the first piece of data that we'll look at as a research team to try to determine where pricing should be, is those last funding rounds and the issue prices for those funding rounds. As typically, larger venture capital firms will have access to more information. So that pricing round and issue price for that funding round is arguably the best indicator in the private market on the true value of the shares and how the firm is doing.
Absolutely. We touched on pricing a little bit. One of the helpful things about the fact that we've been in this market for 13 years now is that we have a lot of information and data on trades happening in the market. So we've completed over 47,000 transactions in late stage private companies, nearly 500 of them. And we have data on where investors are interested in investing, where sellers are interested in selling, what the bid-ask spread is between the two, historic volume trends over time. How can investors utilize that data and what's available to them on EquityZen's platform to even further the information they have to make decisions?
EquityZen, we offer a lot of deals in various names, as you mentioned. If there is a company that you're interested in investing in, it's good to see the information that's available on our site, which is a range of deals that we've done over the past year or 2 years. That's helpful in kind of determining where the company is priced currently compared to historically some of the deals that we've done. I think it's also good just to monitor the name in general, right? Like if there's a deal that's being offered, see if maybe the company is trending upwards or downwards in terms of its valuation or pricing. I think those are super helpful data points.
On EquityZen's platform, if you go onto the company page, you'll see a market activity box at the top of the page, and that highlights some of this proprietary information that we alluded to. So you can see, the most recent trade, you can see the reference price, which takes into account several quantitative factors for our own internal pricing algorithm to help determine what the market price is for some of these private companies. And we also provide a market score for every company, which factors in transactability, popularity, liquidity, and the recency of trades in the market. So again, we really provide this information to try to inform investors as much as possible and turn what has historically been an opaque market into one that is much more understandable and actionable.
The reference price is key to your point. I think it takes into account a lot of really important information, funding rounds, closed deals that we've done, potential bids from major investors in the industry. We'll look at how the company's performing in terms of, has there been growth news? Has there been any negative news or layoffs on the name? I think it takes into account a lot of good qualitative and quantitative information. So would definitely recommend looking at that piece of information as part of your due diligence process.
Absolutely. And at EquityZen, we talked about a lot of the resources that we put together, but there's also more available to you. We have a partnership with Sacra where we can share research that they write as well as a leader in the private markets research category. And that can be found on our individual company pages as well, and is another tool for investors to leverage. Jax, how do you think that research kind of complements what we put together, and how can investors look at those two things in tandem?
When looking at our research, particularly, we look at a lot of the information that's current for the company. So current financials, if available, current growth news, if available, positive news on the company, deeper dives into the business model. Sacra will actually take that next step oftentimes and look at projected revenue for the companies, projected growth, and kind of where they fit within the industry a little bit deeper. It complements us of, we're looking at where's this company at in this current state. And Sacra kind of does the next step and looks a little bit further of what trajectory is this company on and where is it going in the future.
Really helpful resources. So we've talked a lot about the growth potential of these companies. It's certainly one of the driving reasons why investors come to the pre-IPO market looking to participate in that growth. But these investments, like all investments, come with risks. So how can investors quantify those risks and understand the risks for any given investment?
Yeah, it's a good question. There certainly are risks, as there are with any investment that you're looking to make. Here at EquityZen, the research team actually will put together a number of risk factors that can be found on our offering documents for any investment that we offer. Those risks are typically relevant to both the company as well as the industry. So when there was a lot of regulatory risks for cryptocurrency, for example, a few years ago, we had a number of risk factors relating to those available. When you're looking at companies and there's no financial information, there's no revenue information, no kind of path to profitability, we'll highlight that within our risk factors as well. And then just, again, general industry risk factors that we're looking at. So a big one right now is AI. And if there's any copyright infringements with these different AI models, pulling information from various sources on the internet, those risk factors are highlighted in all of our AI offerings. Again, it may not be super specific for a individual company, but if it's an overarching risk that's still relevant for the industry, we'll make sure to include that as well.
Really helpful. So we've armed investors with the information they need. They've made an investment. Great. How would you suggest investors stay up to date on updates related to that company, broader news about the private markets? What are the resources available to them to do that?
The big one is just staying up to date generally on the industry. That can be through various news sources. So I know we have different newsletters that go out that keep you up to date on the market. Another one I use is TechCrunch, or The Information, which have very relevant information for a lot of these VC-backed companies. If you want to get a little bit more in depth and actually monitor a specific company that maybe made an investment in, you can use things like Google Alerts, which will flag any basically search or result that has that company name in the description to an alert system that you can set up and track, hey, is there growth news here? Is something happened negatively about the company? Another key thing that I would use is going to the actual company's pages and checking up on them every so often. So a lot of companies will have a press release section within their company page, and that's going to be any relevant or upcoming information for that company. Whether it's a new product release, a new funding round, usually companies are pretty excited to announce that information, so they'll post it on their site. I would also reference our company page and our platform to go back to see, has the capitalization table been updated? Has there been new news on the company? Has there been a relatively large change in reference pricing? This is all information that we're consistently updating, and investors can utilize that to track an investment that they've already made, as well as look at any potential upcoming investments in the same name. We also offer a portfolio page view. So the portfolio page view will have any relevant material change information on it. So if there has been, a stock split, for example, that information will be updated accordingly, and you will be able to see an accurate version of your investment and how that's currently looking.
And investors will get emails when there's these material changes as well. Is that right, Jax?
Yep, that is correct. We want to keep investors up to date as best as possible for any material changes. So if there is a new funding round in a name you've invested in, you should expect an email from us updating you on how that impacted the company's valuation and some of the terms of that funding round.
One more resource I'd love to highlight is our blog. So blog.EquityZen.com is home to a lot of our in-house research. So whether that's data-driven research, information about the IPO market, news and trends, press releases, there's a lot of information available to investors to educate themselves on the market. So we definitely recommend you check that out. We actually have a long form blog version of this piece as well that we can link to as an additional resource. So, Jax, we've covered a lot of ground. It's clear that private market research requires a different approach than public market research, but with the right tools, that's manageable. So on EquityZen's platform, from our private market Mac to our company pages, we're really trying to make that information accessible and help investors as they navigate this market. Jax, any final thoughts or advice you'd give to investors looking to invest pre-IPO?
Yeah, so I think there's, a lot of information for private companies, and you can get a little bit nitty gritty in terms of doing your due diligence, but I think it's still important to look at the overall story of a company, right? Does it fit into a potential acquisition into a larger technology company? Does it have a good story to eventually go public? These are still all bigger situations that these companies need to think about for the future and to have a successful exit. And it's important to keep in mind those stories, see how they fit into the overall landscape, and really understand their true potential.
Absolutely. Well, Jax, thanks for joining us. It's always great to get your expertise. For those interested in learning more about the pre-IPO market, you can visit www.EquityZen.com/investor.